Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the recently uncompleted but still deadly Vraska the Silencer. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through our Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate links in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commanders we'll be covering next. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Vraska the Silencer is a 3/3 Gorgon assassin with Death Touch that costs 1 in Golgari with the following ability. Whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, we may pay 1. If we do, we return that card to the battlefield tapped under our control as a treasure artifact that we can tap and sack for a mana, and that card loses all other card types. Breaking down her core stats, this version of Vraska possesses a lower mid-weight CMC, a typical stat block for her cost with built-in Death Touch to enable her to trade up in combat, and an ability that lets us turn any casualties our opponent's creatures suffer into value for ourselves. Now, at base, Vraska's ability essentially allows us to quote-unquote stockpile mana for every creature our opponents lose, regardless of who destroys it, letting us pay mana when they die so we have access to more mana through treasures later, which is a fine source of ramp and incidental graveyard hate that can hold reanimation targets hostage, but not the primary reason we're playing Vraska. No, the real reason we have this commander in our command zone is because she effectively turns all our removal spells into 2-for-1s by allowing us to steal our opponent's creatures for ourselves. Now, while it is true that any creatures we take are now just artifacts, meaning they can no longer attack or block for us since they're no longer creatures, they do get to keep all their effects outside of that, meaning we still benefit from any ETB effects they have when they come into play under our control, we may still activate any abilities they may have, and we still benefit from any static abilities they may possess, thereby turning all our removal into potential value we can use to not only disrupt our opponent's boards, but also build up our board with their resources. So, seeing as our commander is very much interested in us inflicting as many losses into our opponent's creature base as possible to make the most use out of her effect, it should come as no surprise that this build will be absolutely brimming with ways for us to tear apart our opponent's front lines, ranging from indiscriminate AoE edicts that can stockpile up to 3 treasures per use, to more precise single target or multi-targeting spot removal to hit and steal exactly the creatures we want from our opponents. Then, to supplement our overwhelming arsenal of removal spells, we'll also be running a variety of on-death payoffs to generate us more value and inflict damage onto our opponents as they lose their creatures, as well as ways to use the treasures we create to generate us even more value and inflict even more damage, positioning Vraska to be an absolute menace on the battlefield whose gaze will decorate our side of the board quite nicely. So let us make our way to an unknown part of Thunder Junction, where Vraska and Jace stand before an omen path preparing to escape to another plane together. They had succeeded, tricking Oko and his gang of mercenaries to open the vault for them and had obtained their prize, Loot, a creature who could visualize every planar connection across the multiverse. And with him they could proceed to their ultimate goal, the remaking of the multiverse, rebirthing it into one that was not scarred by the countless conflicts of the past. They had also been marked by those scars, both physical and mental, from the phyresis that had been inflicted upon them, grim reminders of the miserable and unforgiving multiverse they lived in. And as they walked into the Omen Path, jumping into the blind eternities to an unknown plane, Vraska and Jace, with grim determination, swore that, no matter the cost, their multiverse would be better. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Kicking off our creature base with a suite of edicts, whose sole purpose is to inflict as many casualties into our opponent's creature lineup as possible by forcing them to sack their creatures, we'll be slotting in the AoE edicts Demon's Disciple, Fleshbag Marauder, Grave Lighter, Merciless Executioner, and Plague Crafter, all of which can sack themselves as they come down to net us up to 3 procs off of Vraska as they do so, Wasteland Raider, which may cost a bit more, but we can pump even more mana into it thanks to Squad instead to scale up the number of creatures it forces our opponents to sacrifice, and Archfiend of Depravity, which forces our opponents to cull their board down to 2 creatures each turn to prevent anyone from being able to establish a board state, and making all our other edicts more effective by giving our opponents less fodder to sacrifice to them. And in the event we want to keep our edict creatures alive instead of having them sacrifice themselves to their own effect so we can swing in with them, or just to have fodder for our other self-sac oriented effects, we'll be running Blood-Soaked Champion, Reassembling Skeleton, Mosswood Dread Knight, and Tenacious Underdog as self-reanimating creatures for us to make continual use out of, with the latter two also providing us with repeatable card advantage as we reanimate them to help keep our hands topped off. Then, in order for us to get even more value off our opponents as they lose their creature base, we'll be adding in Morbid Opportunist and Harvester of Souls, both of which turn lost creatures into repeatable card advantage for us, Chevelle Bane of Monsters, who also provides us with repeatable card advantage along with life gain as we destroy specific creatures marked by his effect, Blood Artist and Falconwrath Noble, which instead turn any casualties into targetable drain to inflict even more damage onto our opponents while padding our own life totals, Poison-Tipped Archer, which piles on the damage even further by burning all our opponents whenever anyone's creature dies, Massacre Worm, which functions as a mini-wipe when it comes down to deal with our opponent's small creatures, and then sticks around as a source of repeatable life loss as they continue to lose their creatures to our removal and edicts, and lastly, Overseer of the Damned, which ETBs as a piece of spot removal that then continues to passively grow our board with token bodies by us just playing into our removal-heavy playstyle. Now, with all our creature-based removal sources and payoffs covered, let's switch gears onto a pair of creatures who instead care about the treasures we generate. Those being Marionette Master, who can tack on a sizable 4 life loss into an opponent of our choice every time we crack one of our unwanted treasures for mana, making her a powerful finisher that can eliminate players as soon as she comes down depending on how our treasure stockpiles look like, and Braid's Arisen Nightmare, who will usually be feeding our spare treasures in order to force our opponents to either sacrifice their mana rocks or utility artifacts, or instead have us draw cards while they lose life, though we do have the option to simply sacrifice our spare or self-reanimating creatures to her to force our opponents to lose more of their creature base or generate us card advantage instead. And then to close out our creature base, we'll be padding our core stats a bit by adding in Sakura Tribe Elder as a staple green land ramp source to help speed up and fix our mana base with, or in Frostfang as another repeatable draw source that either forces our opponents to block our death-touching creatures and proc Vraska, or allow us to generate card advantage instead, and the legend Glissa Sunslayer as another source of on-damage draw that can also pop enchantments or remove counters as needed, or who we can simply leave up to screen attacks for us with their superb combination of First Strike and Death Touch. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Building up our removal suite even further as we enter our instant category, we'll first be adding in a few more enemy-only edicts to our arsenal in the form of Liliana's Triumph, Vraska's Fall, Sheoldred's Edict, and Soul Shatter, all of which poke even more holes into our opponent's creature lineup while leaving ours untouched, with the latter two even preventing our opponents from sacrificing low-value creatures to them by forcing them to sack non-tokens or high CMC ones, as well as Vona's Hunger, which at base functions as another enemy-only edict, but we'll usually be holding on to it until we have the City's Blessing so we can instead use it as a partial wipe that bisects all our opponent's creature bases at instant speed for only 3 mana. Then, as some more traditional spot removal we can use to pick off specific creatures we may want to take for ourselves, we'll be slotting in Go for the Throat and Infernal Grasp, both of which can cheaply and efficiently deal with creature-based threats, Death Sprout, which is a more mana-hungry piece of removal, but makes up for it by providing land ramp that we can use to ensure we have the mana needed to spend on Vraska's ability further down the line, Vats, whose split second is nice to prevent our opponents from reacting to it and can potentially hit multiple targets to make up for its higher cost, Putrefy, which can hit creatures and artifacts for better coverage in case we need to deal with back row, as well as Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within, and Windgrace's Judgment, all of which hit most permanents to provide us with the best coverage to deal with almost any type of threat our opponents can throw our way. And then as a pair of removal spells that specifically care about creatures being destroyed to wrap up our removal suite, we have Tragic Slip and Malicious Affliction, both of which become augmented when following up any of our other creature removal sources by either providing powerful non-destruction creature removal, or instead bringing down 2 creatures for the price of 1. And lastly, as our only non-removal instant and our last entrant in this category, we have Deadly Dispute, which we're running as a cheap way to convert our spare treasures into draw that also provides a treasure itself when we use it, so we don't miss out on our mana generation as we replenish our hands. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. We're unsurprisingly back to edicts yet again as we reach our sorceries, though with only 2 entries joining us this time around in the form of Extract a Confession, which at base functions as a standard enemy-only edict, but if we have the spare spells in our bin, we can augment it by gathering evidence to force our opponents to sack their biggest creature to it instead of a creature of their choice, and Rise of the Witch King, which is an edict that does affect us along with our opponents, but makes up for it by reanimating another permanent from our bin if we're forced to sack a creature, usually in the form of another edict effect to force our opponents to sack even more of their creature base. Then the remainder of this slot will see us pad our core stats by adding in the ramp spells Rampant Growth, Farseek, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Cultivate, and Kodama's Reach, all of which provide us with fantastic land-based ramp to speed up our mana base with, and a mini board wipe Culling Ritual, which may only hit CMC2 or less non-land permanents, but is incredibly useful at devastating our opponent's mana bases by blowing away their cheap rocks and mana dorks, slowing them down considerably while generating us mana as it does so, and even allowing us to steal their mana-generating creatures to speed up our mana base even further if we hit any. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. As the only edict we'll be running in this category, as well as the final one we'll be adding to this build, we have the Eldest Reborn, which may be the most expensive single-use edict effect we have, but also serves as a way for us to rip cards out of our opponent's hands to deny them resources, and as a way for us to reanimate the biggest creature or planeswalker in any player's graveyard under our control, so we'll gladly run it. Then, as the last pair of Death Matters payoffs we'll be including in this build, we'll be running Death Reap Ritual and Black Market, which passively generate us repeatable card advantage and ramp respectively as any creatures die off for some more on-theme core stat improvement. And then as our penultimate enchantment entry, we'll be adding in another artifact payoff in the form of Viridian Revel, which procs every time we sack one of the creatures we've stolen from our opponents for mana to draw us a card, since they are artifacts going to our opponent's graveyard, making it a superb way to tack on repeatable card advantage onto the ramp Vraska already generates for us. And then to wrap up our enchantments, we'll be slotting in the Saga Binding the Old Gods, which does enough as a piece of permanent destruction to disrupt our opponents, non-basic land ramp to speed up and fix our mana base, and an AoE source of Death Touch to facilitate our attacks and enable our commander to warrant its inclusion. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Our artifact category will see us add in our second to last way to turn our artifacts into value, that being Tarian's Journal, which lets us repeatedly convert our unwanted stolen creatures, or alternatively our own sack fodder, into card advantage, while also giving us the option to transform it into a repeatable source of reanimation in the late game to give us access to even more edicts or to our previously destroyed payoffs from the bin should we need it. We'll then be dedicating the remainder of this category into padding our core stats with some more generically good entries, such as the ramp sources Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and Wayfarer's Bauble, all of which provide cheap ramp so that we have enough mana at our disposal to pay for Vraska's ability, and the repeatable removal source Viridian Longbow, which may only ping a target for 1, but since it's the creature that it's equipped to that is dealing the damage, we'll be using it to suit up Vraska or our other death-touching creatures to turn them into instant speed spot removal that can bring down any creature we damage with it. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. So, seeing as we're running a veritable arsenal of creature removal to proc Vraska anyway, we'll be taking advantage of our opponent's lack of creatures by running a variety of Vraska Planeswalkers to generate us even more value, and, if we can get there, win us the game through their ultimates, such as Vraska Golgari Queen, whose +2 functions as another repeatable way for us to turn our opponent's stolen creatures into card advantage as well as life gain, while her -3 gives us even more permanent spot removal to deal with small to mid-sized threats, and her ultimate permanently turning every single one of our creatures into an instant kill if they can get in for damage, Vraska the Unseen, who primarily brings even more removal to the table by instantly destroying any creatures that deal damage to her with her +1 to proc our commander, providing more permanent destruction with her -3 to deal with threats, and her ultimate giving us another way to instantly eliminate our opponents via one-hit kill tokens, and lastly, Vraska Relic Seeker, whose +2 generates tokens for us to swing in with, screen attacks for us, or simply sack away to our more indiscriminate edicts. Her -3 provides us with flexible removal and ramp to deal with a wide array of threats while building up our mana base, and her ultimate allowing us to deal with players who would otherwise be out of our reach due to their massive life totals by reducing said life totals down to a single point. That covers all our Planeswalkers, so let's move on to our land base. Quickly going over our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower, Llanowar Wastes, Woodland Cemetery, Tainted Wood, Necroblossom Snarl, Twilight Mire, and Viridescent Bog, all of which tap for both our colors while either usually or always coming into play untapped to provide solid fixing without sacrificing speed, alongside Haunted Mire and Woodland Chasm, which may be slow but whose basic land types makes them fetchable by our non-basic land ramp sources for added consistency. Then, as our lone utility land, we have Bojuka Bog, which will be running to augment this deck's ability to deal with graveyard-focused decks even further by blowing out their graveyards before their creatures even hit the battlefield. And finally, we'll be running 13 Swamps and 13 Forests as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 35 sources of creature removal, 16 of which are AoE edicts, giving us plenty of ways to proc Vraska's creature theft by destroying our opponent's creature base, 14 Death Matters payoffs to generate us more value and or inflict more damage onto our opponents as their creatures die off, 5 ways to generate additional value and damage from artifacts to get even more mileage out of the treasures our commander creates for us, and closing out with 4 self-reanimating creatures and 3 sources of reanimation to get just a bit more mileage out of our own bin as we sack our own creatures to our more symmetrical edicts. For general deck stats, we have 16 ramp sources, 13 card draw sources, 33 targeted removal sources, and 4 board wipes. Our ramp being slightly higher than normal to ensure we have the mana needed to pay for Vraska's effect as often as we can, while our removal is off the charts in order to proc that effect as many times as possible. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.11, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that wants us to ramp hard in the early game to build up our mana base, play our commander once we've accumulated the mana needed to reliably pay for her effect when it procs, and then start playing as much removal as possible to proc that effect as often as we can, using our edicts to tear up all our opponent's board simultaneously, and our spot removal to remove and steal creatures with ETBs, passives, and activated abilities we want to take for ourselves. Then from there, we simply need to keep the torrent of removal coming to prevent our opponents from gaining a foothold on the board, ideally alongside additional on-death payoffs and artifact payoffs to generate us more value and inflict more damage, until our opponents finally succumb and join their creatures. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.43, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we would like to sidegrade our deck in one direction or another without going over budget, we can consider replacing the one-shot removal spells Death Sprout and Tragic Slip with the AoE Edicts, Locust Heavy Destroyer, and Chain Devil if we'd rather have more high-volume removal rather than more precise removal to generate more casualties, Or, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we can replace the Edicts, the Eldest Reborn, and Vraska's Fall with the spot removal, Curtain's Call, and Feed the Swarm if we instead favor precision over volume so we can steal specific targets more often. Then, if we want to upgrade this build by going over budget, Death Sprout can be swapped out for Make an Example as a moderate upgrade, which forces all our opponents to split their creature bases and then lets us decide which gets sacked to always ensure we hit the creatures we want in order to cause the most casualties and or generate the maximum value. Overseer of the Damned can be replaced with Shouldered Whispering One as a more substantial upgrade, who forces our opponents to passively sack creatures on their upkeeps to keep up the creature destruction, while repeatedly reanimating our creatures on our turn so we can get extra uses out of our ETB Edict creatures to pick apart their boards even more. And, as our most expensive upgrade, we can exchange Black Market for Revel in Riches, which still functions as a Death Matters payoff that ramps us, but is better than its predecessor here due to also being an alternate win condition that Vraska's treasure generation can contribute to, enabling that alternate win condition to come online much faster, making it a superb edition and one whose cost isn't even as high as some other top-end editions for other decks, costing us only a few fingers or toes rather than our entire arm and leg. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped the channel reach its 19.9k subscriber milestone. That coveted 20k subscriber milestone is just within sight, and it's all thanks to your continued support. So sincerely, thank you. Now, with our Vraska build covered, the next commander we'll be tackling, after a neck-and-neck poll, will be the alternate casting cost commander, Kellen the Kid, so look forward to that build coming soon. Then, moving on to this week's poll, we'll actually be putting our polls on hold for the time being as we're just about to hit Modern Horizon 3 spoiler season, or rather the official spoiler season that's not just leaks, meaning we'll be tackling the precon upgrades for this set by the end of the month, so be sure to stay tuned for those and let me know in the comments which of the leaked commanders from this set you're most interested in seeing get a build of their own. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck techs I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.